Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our May 8th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and this episode features just what you're looking for, a 2023 growing season forecast from Dr. Dennis Todey, who's the director of USDA's Midwest Climate Hub in Ames. We'll also introduce you to one of the newest members of Iowa Farm Bureau's staff, Zach Brummer, who serves as our organization's Farmer Education Program Manager. Zach's coordinating a unique learning event for young farmers this summer, so you'll want to stick around and hear about that too. But let's start with Dr. Todey, who's going to give us his best take on the weather conditions you can expect in the coming weeks and months. Spokesman reporter Bob Beyond visited with Dr. Todey early last week.
Let's start with where we've been the last few years, in a La Nina pattern. We've had some drought conditions in Iowa. What's La Nina, and what has been its effect on Iowa's weather overall?
Well, a reminder when we're talking about La Nina or its opposite part, El Nino, we're talking about sea surface temperatures and changes from average sea surface temperatures in the Pacific and along the equator. La Nina, in that pattern, we have colder than average temperatures in the central to eastern part of the Pacific, kind of closer to South America. And when those sea surface temperatures change, they change what happens in the atmosphere and changes some of the atmospheric patterns that affect conditions closer to South America, but they also kind of affect different things across North America depending on time of year and how strong it is. So that has kind of been a player for us the last 3 years. We've had a 3-year running La Nina, which is a fairly rare kind of thing. So it has kind of come into play in that, especially during the warm season, there's a higher risk of drought. Not going to necessarily cause drought, but there's a higher risk of dry conditions. And that's kind of been part of the player that we've seen the last 3 years.
Turning to a shorter time period, what has this past winter brought as far as weather in Iowa? Looks like we finally got some precipitation this late winter and early spring across much of Iowa.
We have, but unfortunately, it's not been as useful as we thought it would be, and it's been more focused on the winter. I kind of went back and looked through a little bit. What happened last fall is we were dry coming into the fall, and then we were fairly dry through harvest season and even into the winter. And then we did get wet December, January, February. In fact, top 10 wettest January and February for Iowa. So, there was a lot of precipitation then, and then March and April have been relatively dry again. So we were wetter in the winter, which you may think is good, but wetter during a time of year where we don't expect as much precipitation, again, is not that helpful. And then part of it too, where we really need the water, where we need to get the water in the soil up in the northern and northeastern part of the state, we had frozen soil. So we put a lot of snow on top of frozen soil. So it looks like in places we got moisture back in the soils, but a large part of the area, in northwest Iowa and west central Iowa, we didn't get a whole lot of help for the soils in that area. So while it was a fairly active winter and seemed like it from a snowfall standpoint, the overall water situation is not a huge amount better than it was going into the winter.
So yeah, you touched on that a little bit. The latest Iowa Drought Monitor does show continued dryness in northwest Iowa. What's it going to take to help replenish soil moisture in that area?
Well, the joking answer is it means it's got to rain, but but most of the eastern part of the state right now is still in relatively decent conditions, even though we've been dry somewhat recently. That's actually just kept the surfaces drier and more ability to get in the fields. Starting to see a little bit of drying in southern Iowa, so a little bit of concern there. And like I said, we've had some very dry soils going into the winter. Didn't get a lot of help in a lot of places. And so those long-term deficits we're still really struggling with. If you look at the Iowa State Extension folks up in northwest Iowa, they actually go out and take 5-foot soil cores in the spring and fall to measure how much water is in the soil. And they did that last fall, and where they did this, the wettest of the areas, and they say the wettest had like 2.5 inches of water in that 5 foot profile. And, for comparison, field capacity is like 10 to 12 inches. And we had some places that were down around a half inch of water in that profile. So a few of those have gotten up around 8 or 9 inches now, so in much better shape, but we still have several that are in that 2 to 3 inch range. So we still have some very significant deficits, and that's why the drought monitor has been reflected there. So, we had a rainfall last week, 2 weeks ago. We had 1 to 2 inch rainfalls that were pretty good. Another couple of those would be really, really helpful right now. Maybe let people get things in the ground. Another couple of those rainfalls would help improve our situation.
So that brings us where we are today, spring planting season. We had an up and down April with temperatures in the 80s for a week, then cooler and wet, and now back to the upper 60s and lower 70s this week and into next week. What's the short term forecast for Iowa's farmers?
Our situation, actually, from a planting standpoint, is looking pretty good right now. The overall temperature pattern at the 6 to 10 day, 8 to 14 day, and in the week 3, 4 from the NOAA's Climate Prediction Center all lean towards above average. So that's a good thing now. That gets some heat back in the soils and gets soil temperatures back where they need to be so people can keep planting. It would also add a few early season growing degree days, above average growing degree days, which is a benefit too. So that's a positive. The good side, downside right now is it looks like some typical chances for precipitation, but not overall wetter than average right now. So that won't slow down planting too much. It doesn't look like at this point, except for, maybe some spotty thunderstorms where you get a little bit wetter. So that's a positive. But again, for those places in the Northwest where we need to get more water on the ground is not as good of a picture right now. Though the 6 to 10 day and 8 to 14 day did lean a little bit towards the wet side for parts of western Iowa. So it's not a bleak picture by any means. It's actually somewhat positive.
There's much talk about finally a transition away from La Nina to a more Enso neutral pattern and eventually El Nino. Could you explain that transition and what exactly is El Nino?
Okay. La Nina is the colder than average water. El Nino is the opposite phase where you have warmer than average surface temperatures. And El Ninos have a bigger influence on us in the winter. So we would expect, assuming this El Nino would continue into the winter, warmer than average winter. But the interesting part about this is this looks to be a very rapid transition between the two. Usually it takes maybe a season or a couple seasons, sometimes a year in between the two. We're talking possible months going away from La Nina to El Nino. In fact, NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, they have an advisory system. We're in what's called an El Nino watch right now. It's kind of like a severe thunderstorm watch that conditions could lead to El Nino. And right now, the sea surface temperatures are changing extremely quickly. Unlike weather here, which changes from day to day very quickly, sea surface temperatures don't change very quickly. And these are changing very rapidly. The ocean temperatures are warming up very quickly. So we would expect to see the atmosphere start reacting. And it's quite possible that we'll see some El Nino influence on us during our summertime. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Typically for us, that's a good thing. El Ninos may not be outstanding growing seasons, but some work I did a few years ago when I did my PhD is that El Ninos during the summertime were generally good for us. Usually you had decent to good growing conditions, usually didn't have bad growing seasons. In fact, one of the bad growing seasons was 1993, where we had too much of a good thing from a wet standpoint. So, from an overall standpoint, we would expect more moderate temperatures, less heat overall, and decent precipitation. Maybe not outstanding, but decent precipitation. So, El Ninos generally, from a growing season standpoint, are better for production for us.
So, yeah, you just touched on that a little bit with El Nino and what that means for Iowa's weather. How about like for the next 3 months and into the fall? Will
Right.
there be any differences or changes?
There will be dry areas in the Corn Belt. There are dry areas and drought areas in the Corn Belt every year, just places that miss out. That area of west central to northwest Iowa is a concern because we have those dry soils, so we don't have very much in the bank, so to speak, to get us through some of those dry periods. So, with more moderate temperatures and more regular precipitation, we can still get through those situations, but that's the area of the state I'm more concerned about overall. from that standpoint. And then that area and extending out into the plains area, if you look at the drought monitor, there's still some very severe drought conditions out in that area. Eastern Corn Belt drying out a little bit, but nothing major going on in the Eastern Corn Belt right now.
Looking at past history, how long should we expect El Nino to last before a transition back to La Nina?
2 to 7 years. The cycles are somewhat predictable, but they're a very irregular cycle. Right now, it looks like, by the end of summer, surprisingly, we should be back in El Nino. Likely that would continue into winter. And then we have to kind of watch after that. It could be just a 1 year and done, and then we go back out of it later in the winter, but it's a bit hard to predict at this point.
So, are there flooding concerns in Iowa? It seems crazy to be talking about that, to even consider that with such dryness we've had for 3 years, but the Mississippi River has just reached and exceeded flood stage in recent weeks. How about the flooding outlook for the region?
For nearly everybody else in the state, the flooding outlook is nil or non-existent. Certainly, if you have isolated thunderstorms that could drop heavy rain in a spot, you could get isolated flooding there. But soils and most of our river systems have lots of capacity, so there's not an issue there. The Mississippi obviously is the standout. The difference on that, because it is draining all the snow from Wisconsin, Minnesota, where they had a monster snowpack that took a long time to melt. It held on into the middle of April, and then when those warm temperatures finally hit, it went away very quickly. So that combination of warm temperatures and the higher sun angle melted that snow very quickly. So it's working its way down the Mississippi River right now. I just looked right before we got on here, and the peak of it was reaching east central Iowa right now. It looked like the Clinton Quad Cities area, and was actually getting off peak already in northeastern Iowa. So the only thing that would really change that then would be as if you would have some heavy rain somewhere else along the river. But again, we don't see any major rainfalls coming that would add a huge amount to that. So it's a big flood, but it's not something that wasn't able to be handled, and hopefully won't get too much worse.
Well, let's finish with advice. Any advice you would give a farmer this year, how to prepare accordingly for the overall crop season?
I mean, obviously, if I'm sitting in my situation in west central, northwest Iowa, don't plan on 110% of yield trend. Fertilize, plan on something below trend, because it's going to be hard for us to overcome a lot of those deficits. We can get along okay. Again, we can get by without and not be too bad, but it's going to be very hard in that area to overcome that. Certainly, if your soils are drier, reducing tillage. That's always a thing that helps conserve some of the moisture in the soils, and that's something we encourage anyway. The more tillage you do, the worse the soil structure is, and worsens our water holding capacity. In southeast to eastern Iowa, conditions are better, so you could probably approach it as a fairly good year. We don't see anything that's going to turn things a different direction that way. So those are probably the situations we're most watching right now.
It's hard to give a weather forecast of any length here in Iowa, so we certainly understand the nuance and caveats Dr. Todey is adding as he looks months into the future. Next up is Zach Brummer, who is Iowa Farm Bureau's new Farmer Education Program Manager. Farm Bureau takes a lot of pride in developing events and programs that help farmers make the best informed decisions for their farms, and Zach's going to play a crucial role in making that happen. Here's Spokesman reporter Corey Munson's interview with Zach Brummer.
As an introduction, can you kind of tell us a little bit about your background and how it led you to this position?
Sure. So I graduated from Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa, and then took a position with the Schooler Company as a grain trader, where I bounced around various different facets of the company, trading down in Mississippi on the river a little bit, and then transitioned to Fremont, Nebraska, where I traded corn and soybeans, and then spent about 5 or 6 years in Sarasota, Florida, where I traded citrus pulp and DDGs in the eastern United States. before relocating back to Iowa with my family to be closer to the family farm and help on that operation. Corn and soy rotation in Warren County, Iowa, and also we have about 80 head of cow-calf cattle.
Now, you took over this role from Ed Kordick, who oversaw the farmer education program for many years. Can you kind of talk about the program that you've inherited, the significance of this role at Farm Bureau, and how your previous experience prepared you for it?
I didn't really know Ed before joining Farm Bureau, and, in the 30 days or so that I got to spend with him, I learned a lot about his efforts to educate Iowa's farmers where he saw possibilities. And so, I think that I bring a unique trading background and an understanding of agricultural markets that we can apply. And my hope for the program is that as producers out in the country see what I'm doing and have questions or have ideas, that they can communicate those with me directly through my contact information, which I think we'll have later in the podcast.
Organizing and hosting webinars as well as public events is a big part of this job. What programs do you have planned currently in the next few months? And can you just kind of give our listeners an opportunity to understand how to get involved?
Yeah, so we've got currently 3 webinars scheduled over the next several months. I wanted to give a little bit of a break here in April and May due to planting out in the country, but coming up here on May 25th at 1 p.m., we have soybeans, renewable diesel, and the future with Scott Gerlt, Chief Economist, American Soybean Association. Then on June 8th, we've got a 2023 Ag Machinery Market Update with Greg Roberg, Vice President of Sales at Ag Direct. So folks that are contemplating buying some equipment or leasing some equipment or looking at some even used equipment, I think this will be a really good educational experience for them. And then on July 17th at 1 p.m., we're going to have a webinar on the ethanol market and the changing composition of animal byproducts as that industry continues to develop. And so that's with Kurt Rosentrader, professor at Iowa State University, who's an expert in that field. So those are 3 pretty solid educational opportunities we have coming up. And again, if anybody has any ideas out there, feel free to reach out to me on information they'd like to learn more about as well.
What are some of the key issues that you'd really like to stay on top of here in the short term as far as organizing your educational offerings around them?
I think disciplined marketing is probably at the top of the list here. We're coming off of several really good years for agriculture and Iowa agriculture specifically, and things are changing, whether it's interest rates or the cost of inputs being at record highs or, new crop corn, soybeans having a little bit of a sell-off here recently. We've just enjoyed some really good years. And so as those things start to tighten up a little bit, I think being disciplined in your marketing decisions is going to become significantly more important than perhaps it has been in the last several years. Another thing that I'd kind of like to dive into is farm safety, and especially for kids. Being a young parent, that's become something that I care about personally. And as I poke around, I think there's a space where that can be developed. And so that's something I'm interested in looking into.
Now, you've mentioned hearing feedback from members a few times here. So how do you plan to stay connected with the farming community and get that feedback as far as what educational programs they want to see?
Well, it probably helps that I am a farmer. And so, I'm out there in the fields and I'm out there in the cattle pasture and in the feedlot, and I'm in touch with the issues that are impacting folks. Not all of them, don't get me wrong, but I've got that background and I've got those experiences. So I think that helps right out of the gate to keep in touch with what's impacting Iowa farmers. I think that's critical. And then also Farm Bureau, obviously, we've got, as a grassroots organization, we've got our fingers out there and we're hearing a lot. And so that's where it becomes, important for producers just to continue to give their feedback so that we can support them through those efforts.
So I understand, in addition to all these webinars, you're also hosting a Young Farmer Ag Insight Tour coming up in July. Can you tell us about the objectives of that tour and what members can expect if they participate?
Yeah, so we chose July to get out of planting season, understanding that some folks might have some haying obligations during that time. But our hope is that it gives folks an opportunity to step away from the farm operation for a day or two and just have a fun, relaxing time seeing some of the other agricultural-based opportunities that Iowa has to offer. We're going to be visiting a bison ranch. We're going to tour a lock and dam over on the Mississippi River, an ethanol plant tour. We're going to visit a creamery and also have lunch at a distillery over near Cedar Rapids and a whiskey tasting. And so there's just a lot of different aspects of Iowa agriculture that are touched by each one of our stops, each one of our tours. We're going to have a nice relaxing evening in Dubuque at Hotel Julian, which is a very historic hotel in eastern Iowa. So it should be a really fun time.
Now, it seems like a lot of the stops on the tour demonstrate how farmer-produced commodities are used by other Iowa businesses. Is there kind of an overall theme or lesson to be learned from this tour that you're kind of presenting?
Just a showcase of how critical Iowa ag is to our state, nation, and the world. You know, whether that's the bison and creamery tour as it relates to the state, the ethanol plant as it relates to the nation, and the river as it relates, to the world and exports.
In addition to being educational, these trips also give young farmers a great chance to network and build friendships. How are you balancing out the educational aspects while still providing some downtime for networking during the tour?
Yeah, so it is a bus tour, and so we do have some networking, activities, you might call them, planned for the bus. We've done this before and had some good success making sure that everybody gets acquainted with one another and networks, and by the time that we arrive at the tours, and then also by the conclusion of the trip, that everybody knows one another and knows about their operations. But so also Cedar Ridge Distillery, we're going to be stopping there for lunch, and that's a 2-hour event where we're going to have a tour, a tasting, and a nice catered lunch for the folks on the trip. And so that also provides an opportunity for folks to network. And then that evening in Dubuque, you're free to tour the city, and, hopefully by then folks have had time to communicate and can break out on their own and tour the city. So it should be a good opportunity for that.
Well, it sounds like a lot of fun. If somebody wants to learn more about any of the webinars, the tour itself, or just to touch base with you, what's the best way to reach out?
Visit iowafarmbureau.com. And, if you have any questions, you can email me directly at zbrummer@ifbf.org. Or feel free to call myself if you have any direct questions about anything really, but specifically the tour, 402-616-7110.
Well, thank you so much, Zach, for taking the time. We're thrilled to have you on board, and best of luck going into the future.
Thanks, Corey. I'm happy to be here and look forward to serving Iowa's farmers for years to come.
Thanks, Zach, and welcome to the Iowa Farm Bureau team. As you just heard, Zach has some great experience and strong farm ties that will come in handy as we're building out future learning opportunities for farmers. Zach also mentioned a handful of learning opportunities that you'll want to check out now, including 3 upcoming webinars and a unique tour for young farmers that's going to include stops at an Iowa bison ranch, a distillery, a creamery, an ethanol plant, and more. The Iowa Farm Bureau Young Farmer Ag Insights Tour is July 13th and 14th, and we're capping it at 50 participants, so now is the time to sign up. Down in the notes for this podcast episode, we've included a link to more information about the Young Farmer Tour, the 3 upcoming farmer webinars, and Zach Brummer's email address, just in case you'd like to plant some additional ideas for future educational content. So be sure to check those out after you're done listening here. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you picked up some helpful information and that you'll join us for the next episode on May 22nd. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.